Hello class. For this semester I wanted to record a quick video because I noticed some oddities in the video set that I made a few months ago in preparation for this class. First off, I didn't have student submissions, so I wanted to show you what those looked like. And for some reason, when I was trying to do knockout text, I did not look at my notes at the time and instead just kind of tried to plow through it using complicated groups and masks to produce the image you see here. There was really no reason for that. I should have just paused the video and double checked what I was doing. Sorry about that. So I'm going to show you that now so that when you see me struggling along with groups and masks and you're sitting there thinking, isn't there a better way? There is a better way. I will demonstrate that. So we'll cover that. But before we get going, we're going to be looking at some submissions. The idea for this assignment is I want you to start exploring text as a design element. And for that, I figured a great way to do that is to make album covers. And I do mean like record covers, those big vinyl records. And you can make up your bands, or you can pick a band that you like and do those. I wanted to show you some student submissions. This is the one that I'm going to be producing as a demonstration at the end of the video after I talk a lot about how to manipulate text inside of Photoshop, so make sure you watch those. But let's take a quick look-see at some student work. And I thought that this one was pretty good. As part of the assignment, I'm going to have you try to make sure that it will print all right, even though you're turning it in as a PNG file. So there's some adjustments you'll need to do. So we'll talk about that later. And yeah, it's basically the text. There's doing some fun things with some text. And I thought that was a nice little layout. I wanted to show you all that. And I thought this one pulled it off pretty well. This feels very 90s. It's got the parental advisory warning on it. This is the kind of stuff that you probably see DJs bringing into clubs. I remember in the early 2000s finding tons of albums like this at Goodwill. It's an absolute steal. I don't know what happened to my copies, but they used to be essentially sampling records that DJs would use while they're hitting the ones and twos and, you know, just scratching out some songs and beats. And they'd make them out of really crazy plastic. It wouldn't just be black vinyl. They would use transparent material and translucent material in different colors to try to match the covers on here. And so this was just kind of a blast from the past where you could I saw a lot of stuff like this. So I thought that that was pretty cool that they matched that sort of thing. This one I thought was just absolutely lovely. It was a really nice use, very simple text, but it's absolutely a design element. It's reflected in the types of lines that are being used and the types of outlines. You'll notice that the slight curve to the font selected match very nicely. The outlines coming in, the thin lines here match up the lines in there. Very good work. And lastly, I just got a huge kick out of this one. I don't know if you all remember this early 2000s. This kind of work was very popular, putting little like whiteout lines on top of photographs. It was really in. Just recently, a few years ago, this type of color scheme started to come back in, and so another nice little retro spin on things. Felt very modern because this was, at the time, people were reflecting back on these elements from about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, putting them back together. Did exactly that. Very good work. So I wanted to show you kind of what you're going to be aiming for, rather than just the only one of the one thing that I did in the demonstration. Now that said, this was where I should have used the knockout option, and for whatever reason I just forgot to, I think was the problem. So I'm going to show that to you now, and then we'll get into all the videos. So here's a quick knockout demo. Let me walk you through what's going on in this file, because knockout has some interesting programming behind it. It was built a very long time ago and relies on the concept of the background layer. And that's not the same thing as the bottommost layer, because if you go to layer new, you'll notice that you don't just have new layers and things like that, but if we were to unlock the background layer here, Alt double click, boom, it's converted to a standard layer. Notice no italicized text. It now just says layer 0. The other way you could do that, of course, the more common way, double click it to bring up the new layer window, and you can change the name and the default. Now, this is interesting, isn't it? It's the new layer window, nothing else. What it's doing is literally converting this from a background layer, which a handful of Photoshop's older tools rely on, into a standard layer that we're used to. And that's not a smart object layer, that's just the old school standard layer that's been around for a very, very long time in Photoshop. But it is doing a conversion, so technically it's a new layer. So that means even though we have the last layer here, the bottommost layer, which frequently would be referred to as your background layer because it is in truth behind everything else, it's in the back, it's not technically a Photoshop background layer. The Photoshop background layer would have the italicized text. Now that we don't have one, we should be able to unlock it, and let me make sure that I can find it relatively easily. Yes, right here. We have the option of background from layer. Now, what this does is it reconverts a standard layer into what Photoshop considers a background layer. So notice that when we did that, we have an italicized text, we have a lock icon, it's a background layer. That means nothing can go below it. Oops, I just dropped it into a mask. That's odd and not what I wanted to do. Nothing can go below it. You can't, and I undid it. So let me redo that one more time. Layer, new, background from layer, making sure layer 0 is selected. You can't drag it up. Notice you get this X. It is being handled differently. However, it isn't just being handled differently in the layer menu to prevent you from accidentally dragging your background above other things. There are, like I said, a few menu options that will treat it differently. So we'll talk about that in just a second. In fact, let's do that right now. So just a standard background layer. I just threw some stuff together with quick filter, some lines and all that, and produced this kind of effect. I did some inverts and multiplies, whatever. It's like 30 seconds and it's good to go. Tossed a gradient fill over it in color dodge mode in order to produce this oversaturated rainbow effect. I took an image from Pixabay of that, clearly some blending mode done in it. Looks like a guy was vaping, and then they took this, tossed in some blending modes in order to produce the background image through it, all that stuff. I tossed it in screen mode so that it comes up over here. And remember, kids, don't smoke, it's bad for you. I created a solid color adjustment layer. You've all done this. It's just the adjustment layer, solid color. And I tossed on a mask so that we only see this black bar. And lastly, a standard text that just says knockout. Now, all these components are going to come into play, so I'm going to strengthen this up, increase the size of the layer menu just a little bit. We're almost there. Now, it's important to remember that we have a background layer, literally a Photoshop background layer right now. We'll get back to that in a second. So, let's say that I wanted this black bar to have the words knockout knocked out of it. Now, one thing that you start thinking of is, well, can't we do a clipping mask? I'm just going to hold down the Alt key and click between the two. Now that recolored it. We want the reverse of that. So you start clicking on it and you go, well, now that's not doing anything because the clipping mask is all the text knockout hitting this black bar so you can see everything. We need the opposite. We need to like punch it out instead of clip it out. So there's an option for that. On the layer that you want to become the knocked out effect, and you can do images, drawings, text, all that good stuff. I'm just going to do text right now. Double click on that layer, and you have some options here called knockout. This is a little unusual because knockout relies on the fill opacity to see an immediate effect. So right now we have knockout none, and this is the default for your layer styles. But if we set it to shallow, nothing seems to happen. And at this point, people go, well, what does deep do? Nothing. And then they leave and they never think anything more of it. But if you set it to none for just a moment, our fill opacity will knock out the fill opacity, right? But here's where it gets fun. Set it to shallow. And now, if I set it to 0, it's knocking out on shallow all the way down to the background layer. Tell it okay. So it's literally just coming through here and it's going down to the background layer. Now, if I alt double click this, we no longer have a background layer. We have a standard layer at the bottom of the layer stack. So it tries to go below that. There's nothing. And so we can see it's transparent. It literally drills through to nothing. So that's a little odd. I will undo this, and we'll get back to that in just a second. Now the other option, if we double click knockout, is deep. Let me tell it okay. And it looks as though nothing has happened. So what is the difference between shallow and deep? So we start investigating. The first thing you try to do is convert the background layer to a standard layer, and it has the exact same effect. So what's going on here? Let me show you the miracle of shallow versus deep. First things first, I'm going to set the knockout to none and bring our fill opacity back up. So now we have a default text again. Everything's back to the way it was. Now that said, another way to have done that would have been to double click on it to bring up the layer styles and hold down the Alt key, and that's Option on Macintosh, and it would give you the reset option, and you press reset and it puts everything back to the defaults of the layer style, which means of course 100% fill opacity, no knockout, all that good stuff. So everything's reversed. Enough of that though. Let me zoom out so you can see everything a little bit more clearly. So I'm going to group the knockout and the black bar. And actually, before I do, let me point out something pretty interesting. Fill opacity 0, knockout shallow or deep, it doesn't matter right now because we have a background layer and one other thing's in effect I'll tell you about in a moment. Notice we don't have any of the pretty gradient fill colors, this rainbow gradient fill color, because the knockout is carving all the way through to the background layer. I cancel that. So what if you want to keep the gradient fill or anything in between? Groups is the secret to that. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click on the knockout and the black bar. I'm going to click on the group icon. Now I have this group and I'll go ahead and call it knockout so that we know what's going on in there. So right now we've done nothing else. Let me expand it. Double click on the text, which is the topmost layer here. Now I want to knock out of the bar. So I'll drop down the opacity and I'll set it to shallow. Oh, interesting. Now it's not going all the way down. It's going just to the bottom of the group, which is the black bar, and it's cutting that out. And I could add more things in here if I so desired, and it would cut those out as well. Let me undo those. Now, that said, I no longer need to have a background layer. I can simply have a standard layer stack because the shallow stops as soon as it hits the end of the group. So it will only cut out everything below it within the group. Now, that said, let's go back, and some of you will have guessed what deep does. Go back to deep and look at that. Despite being in the group, it's carving all the way through to the background. At this point, if I change the background to a standard layer with the Alt double click shortcut, it has the same effect and it carves out to transparency instead. This is useful if you're making GIF or PNG images or TIFFs that can produce transparencies. It allows you to punch out transparencies regardless of where you are. So there is a reason for that. Now that said, let me undo this so we have a background. We can use grouping to control with shallow how far things go. Now there are a few more things that we can do. If we came in here and added additional effects, such as, let's say, a gradient overlay, maybe with a slightly different opacity and a better gradient, you could see that even though it's knocked out, it's still applying the gradient overlay inside of it, so you can get some really nice effects. You could do that with things like stroke as well. And maybe put this on the inside instead of the outside. Maybe not color. Well, yeah, let's do color, but maybe not more normal blending mode. Maybe we could do let's do a soft light and then give it something that would produce some soft light effect. Whoops. Well, that wouldn't be it. Yeah, it's kind of fun. All right. Anyway, I'll just put this back on normal for now. We can see the knockout, and we can see that we've applied effects and the knockout's still carving. Now, what's cool about this is that the text is still editable, and once I get out of it, it will reapply everything, which means that I can go through and do additional changes, and it will apply those changes as things happen. as things happen, as you update them. And you can have additional knockouts occurring. So just to make it simpler, I'm going to turn off the effects for a moment so that we don't have those effects. I'm going to make a new layer, put that below the current knockout. I'm going to take this brush and I'm going to set the hardness nice and high, maybe a slightly smaller size. And I'm just going to do a couple of lines to make an X. Once I have that, I'm going to double click on the layer 1 here that I have the paint on, and I'm going to set it to another shallow knockout, and I'm going to decrease the fill opacity so that we get the knockout going on. And voila, we have 2 knockouts stacked on top of each other. More fun, we can do the second knockout to be deep, and you can see how it breaks out to the gray background. And we can put that above the other knockout, and you can see how it cuts it out. Even though the text has a shallow, this big X that we have has a deep. So you can see how those all interact. So I think that Knockout is a very useful tool. It's a very old one. I frequently forget about its existence, and I start fumbling around trying to do it with different, less effective approaches. So keep in mind, it is there. It is useful. Photoshop's help website has an in-depth explanation as to the way that it works, but really that's pretty much all there is to it. I have some photos. I have some videos of other Photoshop gurus using it, which I think they have some great effects. I'll post that to the website soon, so you can take a look at it. But this is really about it. Wanted to make sure I talked about that before you watch me fumble around for a good 10 minutes trying to get the same effect using groups and clipping masks. And I get there, but the problem is that it's not editable, so I can't come back in and do easy transformations and do edits to the text, and have all that going on. This is really the better way of doing it under a lot of circumstances, as long as you remember the difference between shallow and deep and how groups control that and how it interacts with background layers. All right, and remember, I don't need a background layer if I'm in a group, but if I'm outside of the group, or if I'm using deep, I do need a background layer, or it will go to transparent. So there you have it. That's the secret of Knockout. I hope you enjoyed this, and we're about to get into a really fun project. It's kind of a long one. There are a lot of big videos on that, but I know that you'll all work your way through it. So good luck, and if you have any questions, of course, go ahead and let me know. I'll be happy to answer them.